So my name is Cathy Dew. I'm a consultant for a company out of the US called Planet Technologies. I went to art school. I have a painting degree. So how I wound up doing SharePoint, I'll never really know. But I am a consultant, and I'm also honored to be a SharePoint MVP. But I focus on SharePoint a lot from the user experience perspective, how to make it look not like SharePoint, right? Because everybody, that's one of the number one, you make it like not like that. And I also focus on how to improve some of the processes and tools and what people can do in it as far as the user experience. I wrote on a SharePoint 2010 book. 2013 is moving too quickly for us to write books on it a lot, and so I haven't written one on that. Cat Paint one on Twitter, and SharePointCat.com is my blog. In this session, we're going to go through all the different tools and processes. This is what I found over the last 8+ years that I've been doing design for SharePoint is kind of the best way that I think to do it. Now, there's always lots of other ways, but this is kind of my method. And so I'm going to go through that. We're going to talk about how we define the design, how we create the design, what tools we have, and then try to leave a little bit of time for some QA there at the end. So first, we're going to start out by defining the design. This is a step that, while important, I find a lot of people tend to overlook a certain point. And the reason I say that is because I go about this like it's any other project. It's any type of custom development. I need to define it. I need to understand what people are doing. We do discovery before we do branding. So I like to ask different questions. My questions differ on what type of project it is. I try to always avoid, when I'm doing any type of discovery, whether it be for branding or migrations or anything like that, using technical terms. I try to keep it as conversational terms instead of technical. I try not to say, well, I'm going to create you a master page, and what do you need in it? Nobody knows what that is unless they're me or you. So we need to kind of keep it non-technical. And I learn about what the business is, not just the problem. I want to know, from a branding perspective, the only way to improve the user experience is to understand what your business is and how you function. What are you doing day to day? And then I can help design around ways to make that easier. So we kind of go around that. I always tell people, if you're doing this, if you happen to be a consultant like I am, you try to adjust your terminology based off the business. So I use different words for different things, whether it's department or team or area or group or whatever it is. There's lots of different ways to do this and to get these items that you need to discover what you need to create a successful UX. What I like to do is I do a combination of these 4 different processes, whether it be interviews, whiteboard sessions where we're actually drawing things on the board and moving things around. I like to do surveys so that I can get more users to interact with it. When I do things with like a survey, one of the questions I ask is give me 5 sites that you like and 5 sites that you don't like, and give me the URL and tell me one thing you like about it or one thing you dislike about it. So it starts to give me an idea of what things people like navigation and layouts and colors and things like that. I also do game storming, which is a method of making it into a game. I come into a room and I assign people in the room different personas. So I may come up to you and say, today you're going to be marketing, and today you're going to be sales, and you're going to be IT. And we're going to talk about the site and how, from your perspective in those roles, people would get to your information. Right? And so I try to do like some game storming around it and understand how in their minds, because they're obviously not marketing and sales and IT, how people would get to their information, because that's how others in the company may do it. So some of the questions I typically ask, I switch them around. So like I said, kind of adjusting the terms to the group you're working with. So this is a sample of that. Do you often share work documents with people outside of your department? If you're working with somebody that department it's a relevant term for them, I change it to outside of your immediate work group. So it's a group that, so kind of adjusting it to the people you're talking to. These are some of the sample questions that I ask going through and trying to define is, things around UX, who are the primary stakeholders? What are the groups that are going to be providing input on the look and feel? So the colors, the logos, the layouts. A lot of times you go in and you work with IT groups, and companies have marketing teams, right? And the marketing team is the one that is in charge of the colors and fonts and the logos and the things that happen, but IT is the one running the project. And so you need to identify who those people are, because I run into it and I go in and I do a design for the team that I'm contracted to work with, And then they go run it up the food chain, right, to marketing, and marketing's like, oh my God, that's awful. Why would we ever do something like that? Because I never got to interact with them in the first place. So make sure that if you're doing UX, that you identify who those people are that are going to be providing input on the look and feel of the site. Who has ultimate sign-off as to what that is. I always ask, you already have graphic standards defined. A lot of places you'll go in, they already have graphic standards for their company. I'll tell you, I do work with a small company named Coca-Cola, and their graphic standards guide is a booklet about 72 pages long, and it tells you exactly what you are allowed and not allowed to do. This particular blue would never be allowed for them. They don't allow blue anything, anywhere, any adjacent to their company brand at all, because it's Pepsi. So things like that, knowing that, they have 72 pages of strict guidelines for what you can and can't do. What is the purpose of your site? This is a big one that a lot of people don't ask. What are you trying to do? You know, I've got SharePoint, great. What am I trying to do with it? And then I usually ask people, what are 5 adjectives you'd use to describe your site? These get interesting because you always get the fun ones. Well, make it pop or zing, or my all-time favorite one is, can you make my site sexy? That's my all-time favorite adjective that I get because it means something different to everyone. You know, catering to your audience, making sure you're asking questions differently to different people. Doing interviews with people and going through and talking to them. I like to group them together if at all possible. So I like to do groups over individuals when I can. The reason for that is a great thing about doing discovery, especially when it comes to something that people really are opinionated about sometimes, which branding is one of those. Everybody has an opinion on it, is you put them together in a group in a room together and the conversations start sparking, and a lot of times you learn way more about what they're trying to do or what they might like or dislike based off of those conversations. So I like to tell people, I go in, when I do these, I have a document. It's 12 pages of questions. I don't go in intending to ask 12 pages worth of questions. My goal is to go in and have conversation flow. So I kind of know my questions. I group them together by section. Things like, are you going to have business process automation? Are you needing to have additional navigation? Some of those kinds of things. I may hop around based on how the conversation is. It's not a point to go in with a document and kind of follow X, Y, Z. This is like one of those pieces that I put in here that it's always something that you never really know if people know about or not, to be friendly. When you go in, a lot of times I go in and I walk into meetings and I've got people sitting at a table like this. It's not very friendly, is it? So you have to try to get them off guard, you know, get them relaxed and comfortable in the conversation. I always tell people it's a judgment-free zone. That's the first thing I actually say when I start it. I introduce myself and I say, just to establish, this is a judgment-free zone. So if you come in and you tell me that, you know, you like, I don't know, you know, Gmail better than Outlook.com, it's judgment-free zone. I'm not going to care. Tell me what you like about it better. I don't want to know. I will say that I do interviews for regular discovery, for migrations and things like that outside of just UX. And the one that was the most shocking one was I was working with a large company, and we were doing interviews, and we were actually meeting with their tax group. And so they were accountants, and we asked them, you know, how do you do this? How do you store, you know, your records? And they said, oh, it's on a external hard drive in the drawer in my desk. And the IT team just like all the blood drained out of their face, right? Because this is highly confidential, compliance-related information that they've got 12 years of, which you can only keep 7 in the US, in a drawer in somebody's desk that doesn't even have a lock on it. And so they were just like, it's a judgment-free zone. We didn't care. Now, they may have gotten a follow-up meeting after that to give them a different solution, but we did not judge them for how they were doing it. I always tell people, like I said, watch body language, this whole arm cross. They may not, it's hard. When I'm presenting designs to people, I love to do it face-to-face because especially over the phone, you really can't read the body language. You're going to get things where like they're looking at it and they're, you know, and you can't see that if you're on the phone. You have to kind of pay attention to their body language. I always try to get them to talk about designs when I present them, and sometimes it does feel like you're pulling teeth, you know, like what do you think about that color? What about that shape of that button? Do we have enough navigation? You know, and you got to just kind of keep asking the question multiple ways to try to get them to answer. So we do all that discovery, right? It's very important to do, but it should be a small amount of time. After all, you've got a lot of work to do ahead of you. Moving forward, we're just trying to understand what they want. So now we're kind of moving through that. One of the first things I typically do after I do that discovery is start to define use cases, right? Like I said, I want to know the business, not just the problem, because I need to define how the users are going to interact with the site. So I start to define use cases. They may be wanting them to be able to easily submit expense reports or find people. Maybe we're working with teams, we're working with external, we're maybe publishing news. That's what our intranet is going to be used for. So we kind of define those use cases and start to figure out what we're doing and then kind of move on. We start to begin to plan here now, right? Start to sketch it into a design. So I will tell you that I went to art school, and it was really right around the time that computers were just really entering into it. And I did everything by drawing it, and I still do that. So where do I start? As I start to define these use cases, I start with a piece of paper. I carry a sketchbook notepad around with me everywhere I go and some Sharpies, designer. And I draw them out, just a rectangle, and I write words and draw arrows and all of that. Maybe it doesn't make any sense to anybody else, but I start to do that. The reason for that is I'm focusing at this stage on the functionality and the content, not on how it looks. I don't need it to look pretty yet. I need it to be functional. I need my users to be able to get into it and use it, because if I give them something that's hard for them to use, what are they going to do? They're going to put it on an external hard drive and stick it in their desk drawer, right? Now, this is the ideal team of people that you need to do a UX project. Does anyone in this room have this team of people? Yeah, right? Most of us do this and we're a team of 1 or 2, right? We don't have all of these roles. I like to put this in here so that when you go to your boss and say, this is an impossible task you're asking me to do, you have some backup, because I've given you a slide that says these are all the roles that need to be involved in a UX project. And you say, I'm doing this one, this one, this one, this one, this one. Like, can I get a raise? Now, I will say that if you're doing public-facing versus intranet, your plan from here forward changes slightly, right? Number one, because if you're in Office 365, how many of you maybe are looking at Office 365 in here? A few of you. If you're in Office 365, public's not even an option for you, right? They got rid of it. But if you're intranet, extranet, Office 365, but that one applies to 2010 and 2013 on-premises as well. Most of what I'm talking about in this session applies across any of the platforms. So Office 365, SharePoint 2010 on-premises, or SharePoint 2013 on-premises. So we're going to get that out. But these are most of the things you'll have to start to consider as we're going through our plan. This slide is mostly SharePoint 2013 and Office 365, but just because I don't have Device Manager and Device Channels in 2010. The other options still work. But we're defining what we're doing, right? How am I putting my design in? How am I people using it? Do I have a hybrid environment? Am I online? What am I doing? The next thing that goes into, before we can even define what we're doing and draw it out, we need to talk about navigation. This is one of the pieces that I feel like people really, truly forget to pay attention to. In the world of web, the fewer clicks you can use to get to an item, the better, right? Our users this day and age, I like to define it, I call it the millennial and forward generation. Does anyone know what the term millennial means? It's anyone born after the year 1980 will never enter the workplace without a computer. They've never done work without it being technology-based in some way, shape, or form. So those millennials come in and they have that need of instant gratification, right? We all have these that we're attached to. Instant gratification. When we're doing user experience and we're defining intranets for SharePoint, we all know that it is almost impossible to get me somewhere in just 3 clicks. You know, we're like maybe 15 clicks a lot of times. I've got to go to a site, I've got to go to a library, I've got to find the document. Like I've got to really dig in to get to it. So defining the navigation is very important. Going in and how do I get there? What am I doing? Do I have top navigation flyouts, which are the drop-down menus? Am I using custom breadcrumbs? Because if you're in SharePoint 2013, they removed the breadcrumbs. You know, new web trend says breadcrumbs aren't needed. Yeah. Quick launch, which is that left navigation. Are we maybe doing custom navigation? How are we getting to search? What are we doing? Custom navigation is even things like adding our own link bar at the top or adding our own footer with links in it, things like that. So we kind of really have to plan that out. One of the reasons why this is so important is if I have a site and I drill somebody down into it and they need to get home and they can't get back out, what are they going to do? They're going to be like, oh, this crappy thing, I'm going to have to bookmark everywhere. It just doesn't work. We have to really plan that. So this segues into one of my sketches that I did for a customer. This project was a corporation that had 32 subsidiary companies. And each of those subsidiary companies have their own intranet. But corporate decided we need our intranet. We need news that goes to everybody, and they need to come here for HR and IT support and all of that. And they need to go to our intranet. Great. So we started talking about how we were going to do that, but they said, but we need them to easily be able to get to their intranet because that's where all of their work lives. So what we started talking about doing for them is we defined kind of what we had, and then we added in a little drop-down list that would be permissions trimmed to show them the list of intranets that they have access to. So right from every page in corporate, in the top right side of that column, there was going to be a drop-down where I could easily get to my own intranet. Okay? But then how do I get, once I get here to my own intranet, how would I get back to corporate? So what we ended up designing was keeping the corporate banner and keeping that corporate navigation, but then adding in intranets, their site-specific navigation below that. So we kind of created this as an additional bar across the top that's corporate and then their own underneath it. So how did they get back? So that allowed them to get to it and then to get back to corporate as they needed. So designing that out, you'll notice there's nothing there other than that user flow. How am I going to get around? From there, I typically move into wireframes. Now, wireframes are a great option for working with SharePoint because they really allow us to start putting some of the design into it, but at the same time really staying focused on the functionality and the content and not the pretty colors, right? This is a sample one kind of put there. So I'm going to go through a few to show you kind of what I do with them. So here's a homepage wireframe for someone. And some of the things that I always like to make sure I put into a wireframe are things like defining how many levels of drop-down navigation we're going to have. I want to be able to have that conversation with my stakeholders and my decision makers and say, okay, well, you're only going to have one level here, so you're only going to get to the next top level. And maybe you're going to have subs underneath those, so once you get there, you're going to have another. We're only going to have one, we're not going to have two, and kind of going through all of that conversation with them. You'll also notice we focus on things like layout on the page. We're going to have our image rotator that's going to span both columns. We're going to have our left navigation. Putting all of this in there, you can have those conversations without them going, something's a little off with that red. Can't we make it a slightly different colored red? We want to have those conversations. So that's kind of a home page. This would be kind of a web sub-page. One of the things I like to do there is actually put content in the web part zones, but then I identify them with the dotted lines so that they can start to see what a page would look like filled out, but they can see some of the options. Because a lot of the people that you're having the conversations with around wireframes and mock-ups don't do work in SharePoint. So if you gave them a page that just had web part zones, it's just boxes, web part zone, columns, 2 columns, 3 columns, they have no idea what that means. And so you end up spending all of your time trying to explain that to them instead of saying, well, you can add additional items here and additional items here, and going through that. Now, if you happen to be doing responsive design or adaptive design, you would also be doing wireframes for your device sizes, right? So this is for mobile. So you would do things like on these, you can see I designed how the navigation shifts around how the content moves as the navigation is expanded so that we can have those conversations about what they're getting, how they're getting into that navigation, how they're getting around on their mobile device. Okay. I also talk about in this stage with Wireframe of really defining what that content starts to look like, especially if you're doing anything that's custom. So any custom web parts that you're creating or things like that, really kind of defining that out. This is another one that I did for that same customer that I was talking about with the 32 intranets. They also decided that they were going to define a center column of content that was going to be pushed to the home page of all of those 32 intranets as well, so that if those people didn't go to corporate, they still got their information. So we had to go through with them and really define what that center column of content looked like and define what was in there. And this was the first option that we gave to them. They told me they wanted a tabbed image rotator area with content at the top, and they wanted it to house 10 stories. And so I said, really, that's what you want? And they're like, yeah, we think it'll be great. So I did that, put it in here. And one of the important things that I like to tell people to pay attention to, especially as you're presenting wireframes to people, it's a little design concept that in the olden days when we had newspapers that were printed and came out every day, we like to call above the fold. So it's that information that's above the folded part of the newspaper is what's important. That's where the headlines are, right? So in the web world, now we call that above the scroll. What is the content that I want my users to get right away that they don't have to work for? How many people go to a homepage of an intranet and never scroll down? Most of our users, because they want to get to their section to work. So we have to think about the above the scroll concept. So for this particular customer, I put this together, and then I showed them where the page would cut off if you actually showed it at a screen size resolution. And it cuts off, see, right about here. So I said, so all this other stuff you've told me is really important, they don't even see it, because all they see is news stories 1 through 6, right? And I said, so if we really want to do that, we need to find a different way to do that rotator at the top. It doesn't need to be tabbed, it doesn't need to be vertical, it needs to be different. And so we had to work through that with them. But it was really focusing on defining that content and going through and having those conversations and giving the pros and cons of what's been talked about. So from there, we actually moved to this idea. So it became much smaller than that giant 10 tabs, right? And so then it was all about defining out what this is. This was a custom solution. It was going to be a custom app. This was done for 2013. And so this is what I actually like to do as I'm defining UX and we're defining customizations. This is what I deliver to my development team. I don't like to write apps. I do them for branding. I don't like to write them for web parts and things like that, right? So I defined it out, what I wanted it to look like, what the areas are, and then the dotted blue lines are actually the different divs that I want my developers to put in place so that I can add CSS to it, right? So I define it out and I tell them what it is, and I always include like a little snapshot down the side that gives some definition. So this is actually all pulling from a custom list, and we have thumbnails and we have the images and pulling it all together, giving it rotating arrows, things like that. We didn't want it to auto-rotate because auto-rotation doesn't work on mobile devices, and we were deciding this is responsive. And so we made it with just the arrows so that they could get to it, and then the buttons so that they could get to others. Right? So it's all about taking that and shifting it and having that conversation and moving it to something that's functional. Because what we had before, what they wanted, was not necessarily functional, but they didn't know that until we showed it to them. And then we had to go through and define that out. How many of y'all run into this little guy? Mr. Requirement Creep, right? Every time you go through, regardless of what you do, at the last minute, you're going to get it almost there, and they're going to say, but could it? Why, yes, it could. It could do anything you want, but we're out of budget. I'm overworked. This going through the wireframing and the user flows really helps to minimize the requirement creep, because by the time I get to that high fidelity mock-up, and I'm giving them the pretty pictures and the pretty colors and all of that, I've already gone through a lot of the pieces that I need them to talk about and think about, and at that point they really are just doing that. So it starts to minimize this. We never fully get away without it. He's still going to pop up every once in a while, but we can get rid of a lot of it. So next is actually defining the design, right? So we get through all of that other stuff, now we can get to the pretty colors and pictures, right? So at this point, we give them what I call high fidelity mock-up, which is we've gone through our wireframes, they've agreed on layout, they've talked about content. Now I know what to do. I go into Photoshop and I start creating things, right? And the reason I like to do this last is because how many of you have seen the movie Up, right? And the dog in there, squirrel. That's what I feel like people do when you start to give them these. I like to give no more than 2 options because inevitably what will happen, you give them 2 different options and they're going to create what I love to call Franken design, which means they're going to say, I like the logo from this one, but the colors from this one and the layout from that one. Can you put those together? That's what I want. And so then you give them Franken design and they're like, no, maybe not. So I like to give them just 2 options. It tends to make it smaller. But they'll do things like, I did this purposefully. This green doesn't match that green. Shouldn't this green match that green? And that's all they're focused on now, is that this green doesn't match that green. Why do I have 2 different ones? And so we kind of go through and do that from the design perspective. We start to give them high fidelity mock-ups. You can see this one was for Office 365. I like to include the Chrome for the browser as well as the product involved in there, just to help give it an extra little section. So I'll show you a couple different designs. That one was for an intranet. This one was for a public-facing site. So you can see a lot more customizations here than there were in the other one. Fixed width, making it all of that kind of thing. This next one is also an intranet. This one was done for early Office 365. I like to tell people, most of these you see, they look like they're fixed width. The public-facing one was a true fixed width. The other 2 that are intranets are actually a faux fixed width, where I'm adding a margin on the side of the content area so that it looks like it's a fixed width, but it actually expands and contracts based off my screen resolution. It's one of the ways to kind of give me that idea of not having to make 2 different master pages, one that's fixed width and one that's not. I just kind of make it look like it is. It's just a little trick. So we kind of go through those. You can see lots of different options. You can really make it look not like SharePoint. Both of these are fully functioning with collaboration and team sites and all of that on the back side. These are just the pretty home pages. So how do we do all of that? We have to define our tools, right? So what do we do? How do we go through and do all of that? I always tell people when it comes to tools, when you're working with SharePoint, it is all about what you're comfortable with. How many of you in the room are developers? Any designers in the room? IT pros? The SharePoint person? Yeah. Okay. So it's all about what you're comfortable with. There is no right or wrong answer when it comes to working with tools for doing design for SharePoint. I will tell you, I run across the gamut, right? So when I'm doing requirements, which was our first step of defining, right? We want to create an asset plan. You can do these in a number of things. Visio is a great tool for it. Mind Manager, if you're really kind of doing that, that's kind of one of those brain trees. I'll show you one of those next. You can do it in Excel, you can do it in Notepad, OneNote, whatever you're comfortable with to define what this is. The asset plan is defining out, I'm going to show you one. The asset plan is defining out what am I creating? What am I doing in the site? So for this one, it's things like master pages. How many master pages am I creating? In SharePoint 2010, we had to create more than we do in SharePoint 2013 because we had to create a specific one for the Search Center and My Sites and all of that. So we may have multiple master pages for our sites. We may be creating custom page layouts. Again, more page layouts we had to create if we're customizing them in 2010 than in 2013 because things like the meeting workspaces and some of those that had custom placeholders in them that you needed to have in that page layout if you were trying to do that and customize it. So we may have more page layouts there. What if we're putting video in our site, right? How am I just exposing that video? Am I using Flash, Silverlight? Is it streaming? Do I have audio? Thinking about that. Are we doing third-party customizations or web parts, the tools that we've purchased? Do I need to skin those so that they look like the rest of my site? What about navigation? So again, going through that navigation list, what are we doing? What are we using? Top navigation, quick launch, breadcrumbs, custom footers, custom headers. Am I using in 2013 managed navigation with metadata? What am I using? And I define all of that. Things like information architecture, knowing how I'm creating sites underneath it so that we know if we're creating more customization. Is it flat? Is it deep? Am I using fast in 2010? Am I using Search Center? Am I trying to customize any type of content roll-ups so that maybe I'm going across site collections or not? We got to talk about some of that. Are we creating a custom logo, or are we using the existing company logo? A lot of people like to name their intranets. Things like I had one customer that I worked with that decided that they would name their intranet. They were a construction company, so they created a character for their intranet. It was a little construction guy, and his name was Hub. It stood for Hubert U. Builder. And Hubert U. Builder was on every page of their site, and he dresses up for holidays. So for Christmas, he's been like Santa Claus and a snowman and an angel. They have a person that the full-time job is to illustrate new hubs, and they put him in the site. And so, am I doing something like that? And of course, they kind of took it like 4 steps farther. It's kind of fun to work with them to define what Hub was and how he was going to be. He became like the little office paperclip from old versions of Word. You clicked on him, and it actually takes you to search so that you could find information. So he became like their paperclip. He doesn't animate and dance, but he changes costumes quite a lot. Then like things like the name. So those two kind of tie together. What am I naming it? Who's naming it? Are we having a contest? What are we doing? What is the URL going to be? How are people going to get to it? Are we going to do things like deploy an icon to their desktops via group policy? Does that show the name? Does that have the logo? We have to talk about a lot of things because as the designers of it, if they're doing things like deploying an icon to the desktop, we have to define that and customize it and show that so that we can go through there. So this is a sample asset plan. It's basically taking everything that we talked about and defining it out. This is what I'm building. This is my asset plan. This is one of those Mind Manager brain maps. So it's all kind of branched off, but you can do the same thing in Visio. So then the next step was the wireframe, right? What do I use to do wireframes? So the ones that you saw were actually from a tool called Balsamiq. Balsamiq is a great little tool to do wireframes. It's relatively inexpensive. I think it's 99 US dollars. I'm not sure what the UK translation is because the dollar is not worth very much. But you can install it on as many machines as you would like. I have like 11 devices that I haven't installed on with the same license key that are all mine because I have Surfaces and computers and Apple products, right? And it goes across whether it's Apple or PC, doesn't matter. So it's a great little one. The link here is actually for that first wireframe that I showed you that was the team site. It's actually out there. You can go download it and pull that into Balsamiq, and you have some of those. There's also a lot of other templates and things like that if you do some Googling around. Oh, I'm sorry. If you Google with Bing, because Bing is an awful verb, you know. I told Microsoft this. I was like, look, one time I was like, you guys are clever. Bing, because it's not Google. I get it. It's cute. But it's a really bad verb. Google's a great verb. I Googled it. Go Google that. Bing. What's past tense of Bing? Bing, bang, bung. I'm not using any of those. I could say I binged it, but when I type that out, it's binged. Nobody wants to binge on anything like that. So they actually told me you can say Google it with Bing. So Google it with Bing. There are a lot of templates out there that you can go out and find, things like web parts and all of that, so you don't have to build all of those from scratch for Balsamiq. You can do them in Visio. If you have Visio, you don't want to go spend any money, you can do those wireframes in Visio. If you happen to have Adobe Creative Suite, you can do them in any of those tools, InDesign, Illustrator, Photoshop. There's another tool out there that's called Azure, not to be confused with Microsoft Azure. Azure is a web development tool that actually does wireframing, and it does click-through wireframes. The reason I don't use it is it's really expensive. It's like almost $1,000 US for a single license. So for me, I pay for all of my own tools, and my company does not, and that's a little expensive for me. I'd rather go buy some more shoes than pay for that. And I'll tell you, I have done wireframes in pretty much anything you could think of. I actually worked with a customer one time, and the stakeholder was the CFO of the company. Let that sink through for a minute. Who's the CFO, Chief Financial Officer, was in charge of what the intranet looked like. And he gave me a wireframe for what he wanted to look like, and it was done in Excel. So I had to give him one back in Excel. It was the only thing he understood. So you could do them even in Excel. What are you going to do? You got to work with what you're given. High fidelity mock-ups, those are those pretty pictures. You can do those in anything. Myself, I do them in Photoshop because I went to art school. I love my design tools, right? I love my Adobe products. You can do them in anything out there, really. I've had people do them in Paint. In fact, I got one from a customer this week that I was like, you obviously did that in Paint, and you're obviously colorblind because I don't know what that is. But you can do them in anything. Really, it's all about picking the tool that you're comfortable with and moving forward with that. Keep checking my time. I don't want to run out. Development tools. How do I actually build it? So once we get all those pretty designs, we actually have to build it, which, by the way, I have 2 other sessions here at this conference. One immediately after this, we're going to talk about building those design assets for on-premises SharePoint, both 2010 and 2013. And then tomorrow, we're going to talk about doing it for Office 365. It's in the afternoon. So if you want to know, actually see them and talk about code and what's in that, those sessions are where we'll do that. I just don't have enough time in an hour to do all of that in one. So what development tools? With SharePoint 2013, one of the big things that they came out with was they put the Design Manager out there, which says that you can use Dreamweaver or any tool out there that you're comfortable with to do your web development for your custom UX. I kind of chuckled when they said that because I'd used Dreamweaver like in 2007 version of SharePoint, so it wasn't really a shocker to me. So now you can use really any tool. Dreamweaver is a great one if that's what you're comfortable working with. Visual Studio, you can use Visual Studio if you're comfortable in that. SharePoint Designer, Expression Blend, I've gone so far as to create these files in Notepad. So just depends on what you're comfortable with. Myself, my preferred tools, I work with SharePoint Designer when I'm in the development stages, like the early development stages where I'm doing the majority of my work and going through and like saving this, oh, I want to change this line of CSS and see what it does. I do that with SharePoint Designer. When I'm ready to really get in and test it, and I think I've got about 75% of my design done, I move to Visual Studio. And there I start working with it there, and I'm then deploying it as a solution or an app and going through that way. But there's no right or wrong answer here. It truly is what you are comfortable with. When you're in SharePoint 2013, the designer doesn't have design view anymore, so it's all code to work with any of the asset files. So at that point, it really truly doesn't matter what tool you use because you get the same view anywhere you are. My reason for using SharePoint Designer is I like the direct integration where I can open a site and I can get to all of those files right through it. You don't get that in any other program, right? If I'm using Dreamweaver, they tell me to map the drive, which works great if you're working with one site. If you're working with multiples, not so much. Also, if you happen to have an Apple, mapping the network drive doesn't work as well either. But the SharePoint Designer has all of that integrated. That's why I tend to stick with it. Now, deployment. We've talked about designing it. We've talked about a little bit about developing it. The last piece of it is how do I actually put it in place? How do I put it into my environments? So for that, what I like to tell people is that there's a lot of different methods, and it really truly depends on what you're doing as to what is the right method. So if I am working in SharePoint 2010 and I have on-premises, my preferred method is going to use a solution. I'm going to write a solution for that. I'm not going to go through the publishing infrastructure, which I know is listed up here, and do it that way. I'm not going to do it through SharePoint Designer, which you can do, but not great. Because putting it as a solution makes it, for those of us who've been doing this for a while and working with SharePoint, is managed code, right? So I can update it one time. I can manage everything easily. So we can put it in as a solution. If I do it through the publishing infrastructure and I go to site settings and under look and feel and I change the master page or I change the alternate CSS there, that's kind of for that site only. I can tell it to inherit all of the others as new things get created, but I don't have as much control over it. Anybody else that has permissions for it at that level could go in and change it. I don't want them to. That's why I use a solution. It's managed that way. If you're in 2013, you can use all of these methods listed on the board. 2013, though, we have the addition of apps and being able to use apps to deploy branding. If you're interested in detailed, how does that work, I'm going to talk about them and what they are and why we should use them in my Office 365 session tomorrow. But if you want to see code for how they work and all that, Vesa is doing a session before that. I'm not sure what room it's in. That's a branding implementation using apps. I don't know. Do you have what room he's in? Is that not Tuesday's schedule? Today's, not Tuesday's. They gave me an extra page. I'll look it up and I'll tell you in the break if you want to know. But tomorrow, Vesa is doing a session on how to deploy it using an app, which is an interesting concept. Okay. Does anybody have any questions? Did I overwhelm you? Did you want to see some code? You got to stick around for that. So I'm going to let you go a few minutes early. I think there's a snack break in between. Always important to get your caffeine and your snack in the afternoon. And we'll come back if you want to come back and see some of the code for on-premises. We're going to do that next. I have cards. If you have questions and you don't feel comfortable asking them here, you can come up and get one of my cards. I answer questions all the time. Also, about 2 months after this, I'll put these sessions up on my blog. I don't do it right away. You're going to get DVDs, so you're going to get the recording of this session, and I like to give Steve time to have that information, acknowledgement, management kind of session before. He likes to kind of keep them in. So I'll put them up on my blog, but I have other stuff on my blog if you're looking for ways to do things. It also has my email address, which you can always email me. I do help people with emails if they are stuck doing branding. So thank you. Go enjoy, get a break, get it to cool off a little bit, come back.